This is a recording of the second public forum for the Wayland Housing Production Plan held on November 18th, 2021. So it's 6:34 now. I think why don't I go ahead and sort of just briefly get things started. And by the time the actual presentation proper begins, I think it'll be 6:35. Welcome everybody to the webinar number 2 for the Wayland Housing Production Plan. My name is Tyler Marin. I'm a consultant with Barrett Planning Group. I've got several of my colleagues here tonight who I'll introduce in just a moment. Let's see, I don't believe anyone from the town wanted to speak, so we'll just go right ahead.
Yeah, we can go ahead and kick it off.
Yes, so you just heard from Judy Barrett. She is, the principal planner of our firm. She'll be giving the main presentation tonight, and also with us to assist with the breakout groups later on are Alexis Lanzalotta and Fiona Coughlin. So thank you very much for having us. And it's been a pleasure so far to work in Wayland. So Judy, unless there's anything else you want to say, I can get the presentation up.
No, I think you should go ahead and start the presentation and we'll just work through it.
Okay. Oh, I forgot to share my screen first. That's important. Okay, can you see that?
Yep, it looks good to me.
Okay, excellent.
So welcome everybody. As Tyler said, I'm Judy Barrett and I'm the principal of Barrett Planning Group. I know most or many of you anyway have seen Tyler before on this project, and he's done an just really exemplary job. I wanted to kind of step in this evening and at least present the beginning part of this meeting, which is really about the goals and strategies of the plan. This is really sort of where things get very, the rubber hits the road, so to speak. This becomes kind of, what are you going to do to address housing needs on a going forward basis under the plan? So the first part of this presentation is really laying out a bit about housing production plans and what the goals and strategies are that we're thinking about, and then giving you all an opportunity to participate in a discussion about those and what you think about them, and to weigh in, and maybe you have suggestions that we have not come up with despite our best efforts, and certainly we want to hear from people in your community. So I'm going to be with you for the first part of this meeting, which is the presentation. Tyler will take over for the breakout groups, and Alexis and Fiona will be helping him work through those and work with you as well. So if you have questions while I'm going through the slides, we would love it if you would put those into the chat. It's a little bit easier sometimes to kind of work through the slides rather than to stop and go and stop and go. So I would say if you have questions, try to use the chat and we will get to them. But let's maybe try to work through the slides first. So next slide, please. I'm just going to do a very quick overview of what a housing production plan is for the benefit of anybody in this meeting who may not have participated in the first forum. So this is what we've been hired to do by the town, is to prepare an update of a current housing production plan. And that is a kind of heavily regulated planning process that covers, focuses primarily on housing that is affordable, as that term is used in Chapter 40B. So I'm going to explain all of this as I go on. So when we talk about affordable housing for purposes of a housing plan, housing production plan, we certainly acknowledge that people use that term in different ways, but in this context, it is primarily housing that is affordable to people whose incomes fall within the ranges that you see on this chart, principally focusing on the 80% column. Of course, the lower income limits are also served, but many 40B projects kind of aim at affordability at that 80% level. And those units, when they're properly monitored and regulated and so forth, count on what's called the Chapter 40B subsidized housing inventory. For housing to be eligible for the subsidized housing inventory, it also has to be safe and decent, in good condition, appropriate for the size of the household that occupies it, and is protected and monitored by a long-term restriction so the unit stays affordable over time, and is also equitably located throughout the community. Next slide, please. So you probably all know, but I just feel I have to explain, Chapter 40B is actually the regional planning law. And a lot of people don't understand this. They think it's just the affordable housing law, but it really isn't. The affordable housing provision is just 4 very small sections of the same statute that created the Metropolitan Area Planning Council and all the other RPAs that we have in Massachusetts, regional planning agencies that we have in Massachusetts. So the way the law works is that if less than 10% of the housing in your town is eligible for the subsidized housing inventory and listed on it, or rather, I'll just say this in the reverse because this is more relevant to Wayland. When at least 10% of the housing is affordable and on the subsidized housing inventory, the decisions that may be made by the Zoning Board of Appeals on future comprehensive permits are protected, if you will, from being overturned by the State Housing Appeals Committee. So that's sort of the major benefit, is that the developer doesn't have an automatic appeal to a state administrative entity, and also, really the board just is able to exercise more control over the project and its permit. But I also think the other thing people need to understand about Chapter 40B is that it is a permitting law. It doesn't guarantee deeply affordable housing. It doesn't provide directly any form of subsidy. It simply says the housing shall be affordable, and it's under the terms that I explained earlier. So, this is why a lot of developments today kind of aim for that 80%, what we call moderate income level, because there is no cash subsidy, because many years ago, the federal government and eventually the state stopped providing funding for affordable housing. And so we're in a situation today where, for the most part, the responsibility for creating affordability is falling in the hands of private developers who have to figure out how to make it work. And so that has a lot to do with why the income limits for many 40B developments are at that kind of 80% level, which is really the upper limit. Next slide, please. So a housing production plan is a tool for communities to try to get a little more control over the Chapter 40B process, which, the reverse of kind of that 10% is if you're under 10% and a developer is not happy with a decision that the Board of Appeals made, the developer has access to this, I guess I would call it an appeals process that's generally favorable to the developers. So that 10% is kind of an important thing. It's not the only thing, but it's important. So a housing production plan is a way for the state to say, look, if you work on meeting your housing needs and you're making steady progress toward increasing your affordable housing supply, you'll get some temporary help in managing the flow of other comprehensive permits. And so it is very much kind of geared toward, how do we help you get to and stay at that 10% level? It is very much focused on both local and regional housing needs. And if you wonder why that's the case, if you just think back to, where does this law reside? It resides in the regional planning statute. So there's definitely a kind of regional connection here, which really kind of has to do with, how can people choose to live in Wayland, and do they actually have a choice? Next slide, please. The town is updating this plan because it wants to stay above the 10% level that it currently has reached. Some towns do fall under that 10% again. It has happened more than you probably want to know. But even if you manage to stay at 10%, which would be wonderful, steady affordable housing production will kind of help you keep pace with just the ordinary operation of what's happening in the market in your town, which is the production of some fairly high-end and lovely single-family homes. So as you add more housing in your town, if some of it isn't affordable or not enough to stay over 10%, that's another way you can kind of fall below that threshold. But the other thing I think that's important about updating a housing production plan in towns like yours is that you find yourselves in a position where you can get a little more control or influence over how the comprehensive permit works for people who may not have always been that well served by the comprehensive permit process. You can sort of have a little more sway over, for example, how deeply affordable those projects may be, how much you expect the developer to sort of reach a little deeper into their pockets and say, well, maybe, maybe we won't provide 25% affordable units, but we might provide 20% for households that are very low income, and that will still count on the subsidized housing inventory. So you have a little more control, I think, in that regard. And I think the other thing that communities can do when they're over 10% and they're staying there is to really focus on some other kinds of needs that aren't necessarily that well addressed, such as needs of frail elders whose housing needs are a lot more complicated than traditional active adult type of senior housing is designed to support. Disability accessible housing, which is something we've heard about from people in your community as a need. The other thing that is helpful too is being able to think about, well, what does housing preservation really involve, and how can we do that in a way that preserves affordability in our town, both at or below, and perhaps even above that 80% magic number. And then the other thing I'll just point out is that many of the suburbs we work in, they've been difficult communities for young families to move into for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is an aversion to growing school population. Well, once you've kind of gone beyond Chapter 40B and you have more control, you really have a way to be a little more insistent with developers about providing family-oriented housing, which in a family-oriented town would make a lot of sense. Next slide, please. So where do we get our information for these plans? Kind of all over the place. We always start with the town. We try to find out from the town planning department and the town administration and others, sort of what data do you have? Your town has a pretty nice geographic information system mapping installation, which we've certainly taken advantage of. We try to get building permit data just to find out what's been going on in the town in terms of the rate of production. And naturally, we look to the Census Bureau, the Federal Census Bureau, for data because Census 2020 is just coming out. And as you probably know, there's very little information from Census 2020 at this point. For the most part, what we're relying on for this plan, and virtually any plan we're working on, is a companion survey administered by the Census Bureau called the American Community Survey. And I just want to point out that even when Census 2020, when all the data are finally released, you'll never get the demographic and social information that the ACS, called American Community Survey, provides. They're just simply different tools. And the ACS is invaluable for this kind of plan in ways that really the decennial census is not. We also just look to historical census data, like how has the town grown and changed over time? Naturally, these plans would be easy and deceptively simple and probably not accurate if all we did was look at data. So we also talk to people in the community. Tyler has done a number of small group interviews with folks to try to learn more about the community and what's going on. Certainly, there was also a public survey, which was very helpful to us for the public to weigh in on housing needs and how they might be addressed. And then public meetings like this one, frankly, it's why we've designed this meeting so that you're going to get a chance to talk and not have to listen to me all night. So all of those sources are kind of helpful to us in developing one of these plans. Next slide, please. A housing production plan consists of 3 key pieces, and we're really tonight focusing on the latter 2 on this slide. The housing needs assessment, I often think of as the heart of the plan. It's kind of what are the needs in this community and in the region, and how can people choose to live in Wayland, and how can Wayland people who may not be as wealthy as some others, what options do they have to try to stay? Well, we've kind of worked on that needs assessment. Now we're looking, and we're going to be asking you for input tonight on what the goals of the plan ought to be and what kinds of strategies or actions could be built into that plan to address those goals. So those are the 2 pieces that are really we're into now, and we're asking you to be into with us. Next slide, please. If you don't mind, I'm going to ask you to just hold on to any questions, and just because I've only got a few more of these to go through, and then you can ask me all the questions you want. Go ahead, Tyler. Next slide. So there's kind of specifics that the state requires for the goals. We have to kind of do 2 things. One is this sort of numerical goal. That is, how many units are you going to try to produce per year? to work toward or stay at that 10%. And that's a mathematical formula that the Department of Housing and Community Development sets. The other type of goal is qualitative. It's what kind of housing do you want to see built in comprehensive permits or other projects being built in your town that's affordable, that provides for a range of housing types, and is also feasible in your market. So there's these qualitative metrics, and then there's this numerical goal, which is based on the number of housing units that were in your town as of the most recent decennial census. Now, the truth is that part of the housing data needed for that has been released for 2020, but not enough for the state to update the subsidized housing inventory. So not to frustrate everybody, but we probably won't have all that information from Census 2020 for another year. That is basically what we're hearing right now from the Department of Housing and Community Development in Massachusetts, as well as the Census Bureau. Next slide, please. We want to talk to you about 5 goals tonight, and they are as follows: to encourage 2-family and community scale multifamily dwellings and discourage tear downs. There is a relationship between those things, which we'll get to. Keeping Wayland above the 10% statutory minimum under Chapter 40B so that you maintain that control and you can focus more on your local needs. Increase your focus on local and regional housing needs, which is another way of saying, if you don't have to worry so much about the 10% and a developer coming along with a project you don't want, now you have the luxury of saying, okay, so now really what we need to do to address the needs in our community. Promoting sustainability in new housing development. We have some thoughts on strategies for that. And then committing leadership, funding, and regulatory reform to affirmatively furthering fair housing in Wayland. So equity is a critical part of these plans, and it's certainly an important part of the goals for Wayland. Next slide, please. So DHCD, in addition to having specific requirements for goals, also has certain requirements that need to be addressed in the plan somehow for strategies. And what we've tried to do, and I think you'll see when you get to these slides and into your discussions and breakout rooms, we've tried to connect strategies for the goals to strategies that DHCD will require in order to approve the town's plan update. And they are things like, you have to kind of say, well, what zoning districts do we have in our town where we could make some changes to create some lower moderate income housing? Are there sites in town where we could encourage someone to file a comprehensive permit? What do we want to see in the residential or mixed use developments that we want to have include affordability? Do we have any municipally owned property that the town is willing to commit to making available through a request for proposals process for affordable housing development? And then a strategy, at least one, if not more, ways to participate in kind of regional collaborations to address housing development. So those are kind of, we have to hit those boxes, as well as the boxes for the goals, and also meet what the town can plausibly do and probably ought to do as it now moves into this phase of being able to focus on its own housing needs and the needs of the region. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to quickly kind of go through these goals and some strategies that we came up with that we think are worth discussing with you. For that goal number 1, encourage 2-family and community scale multifamily dwellings and discourage tear downs. You have a median sale price that's scary this year. It's almost $1 million. So some strategies that come to mind are, buying down existing market rate homes to keep them affordable.
Am I turning that off?
Pardon me? Can everybody make sure you're on mute? Buying down existing market rate homes. A lot of towns want to do this. I have to tell you, it is a very inefficient way to create affordability, but it is something that you may want to consider. It's just that in terms of, providing a subsidy, it's a very expensive way to do it on a per unit basis. Changing zoning to allow accessory dwelling units and duplex conversions as of right. There is definitely a wave afoot in Massachusetts to make ADU so-called zoning as of right in order to facilitate the creation of those units. But you also have options or opportunities perhaps to look at your own existing zoning and think about ways to make it a little easier to do duplex conversions. Create a working group to explore acquiring the Launcher Way property. That came up in any number of ways. And encouraging the formation of a community land trust to acquire land and create affordable units. And we'll talk about this again more in the breakout sessions, but a community land trust is a different entity from a municipal affordable housing trust. It's actually a private entity that forms to acquire land and hold the land so that changes in the land market don't feed into the eventual sale price of a housing unit. So land is kind of taken off the table. And it's a widely used tool in other parts of the country. Interestingly, not so much in Massachusetts, but I think we're seeing more of this now. A really good example of a very successful community land trust is the Island Housing Trust on Martha's Vineyard. Next slide, please. Keeping Wayland above the 10% affordable housing minimum under Chapter 40B. You know, again, this is kind of an important one for you folks. So some possible strategies might be identifying locations to encourage so-called friendly Chapter 40B comprehensive permits and taking active steps to find developers to work with you. I find that both of these are really critical. It's one thing to kind of have a site and you put it out there for housing. It's another thing to actually go out and find developers you can work with. And I think to have a really successful project on municipal land, you kind of have to be working on both sets of those strategies. Identifying potential for infill housing along the Route 20 corridor, you know, and looking at that. Next slide, please, goal 3. Increase focus on local and regional housing needs. So again, just as a reminder, staying above 10% gives you a lot of flexibility. So some potential strategies we'll be asking you to discuss tonight are increasing the availability of funds for subsidized housing below 80%. How can you be an investor, a lender, as a town, a granting source to help developers, probably nonprofits, frankly, create more deeply affordable housing? You can certainly consider the possibility of offering some property tax reductions, kind of like a tax increment financing that we often do in Massachusetts for economic development. Being able to do tax breaks for developers who provide deeply affordable housing. Amherst is a good example of a community that went to the legislature and got a special act of the legislature to provide that very kind of relief. And they've entered into TIF-like agreements with a couple of developers for deeply affordable housing around the center of town. Proactively plan for opportunities to create group homes or independent housing for people with disabilities. This is a need everywhere we work, is this sort of need out there that people are really baffled by, is how do we provide more appropriate housing types for people who have disabilities, both who can live independently and those perhaps who can't. Next slide, please. Goal 4 is about promoting sustainability, and we talk about sustainability in housing in a kind of very broad way. So certainly green design principles and flexible design, that's very important. Encouraging residential conversions as an alternative to tear down is another thing you can consider. I would point out on Nantucket, some of you may be familiar with this. On Nantucket, the demolition delay bylaw is really not connected to historic preservation much at all. It has to do with any kind of tear down. And the rationale, of course, is we don't want to have a lot of construction debris leaving the island. So, you know, there's environmental reasons to kind of think about discouraging tear downs, but you have to make it marketable. It has to make sense in your market area. Encouraging or requiring universal design in age-targeted or mixed-use developments, and amending your zoning to make sure that universal design is actually a review standard in site plan review is a very important thing to consider. How do you make places more walkable? How do you make places more accessible? That's what universal design is all about. Encouraging or requiring multifamily developers to provide meaningful and effective and affordable transportation demand management for residential development is another appropriate thing to consider. We need to all be thinking about ways, especially in suburban communities, where we can encourage a reduction in the use of single occupancy vehicles. Requiring well-designed bicycle parking in multifamily and mixed-use projects is another way you can encourage sustainability by keeping cars or discouraging cars from being on the road. And then scale or, you know, preferably reduce minimum off-street parking requirements to accommodate smaller households. Next slide, please. Goal 5, affirmatively furthering fair housing, is the goal is specifically affirmatively furthering community-wide equity and inclusion through housing policy. And this is really about, every neighborhood has an opportunity to do affordable housing. Somebody has an opportunity. And the question is, what's the right opportunity or type of approach for a neighborhood? And they're not necessarily all the same, but everybody can do something. So some strategies we were thinking about for this goal are to explore opportunities to accommodate a variety of special needs populations throughout the town. The town of Lincoln is a good example of a community that's used CPA funds to help a couple of group home providers acquire property in Lincoln and create and operate group homes. It never would have happened without CPA resources. The properties are simply way too expensive. Increasing town government's capacity to provide fair and affordable housing in all neighborhoods. We were talking about this in staff meeting today here on another project. Communities have 3 things they can bring to the table to influence development. It's regulatory reform. What do you do with your zoning? It's money, whether it's infrastructure improvements or providing CPA or other funds for housing subsidy, and it's leadership. And I think my experience in over 30 years in this field is that leadership is something every community needs to be working on. It isn't just having a competent housing trust or competent housing partnership. I think you have those things covered in Wayland. It's what's the message from the top down, and how does your board of selectmen, how's your planning board, how's your finance committee, how does everybody in town hall talk about affordable housing? Are they making it just as important as any other boards that people might serve on? Again, I don't want to keep mentioning other communities, but Nantucket's an example of a town that had a housing trust that was a mess 4 years ago. And today people clamor to get on that trust because they've completely reinvented themselves. And so it took a lot of leadership to make that happen, but they did it. It has to be something that everybody sees as a very important function in town, not just something that the community has to do. Appoint housing advocates to municipal boards. It would be helpful if you had more people spread out through town government who understand affordable housing. And then consider, foregoing or, either reducing or just not asking for local preference in affordable housing developments, recognizing that part of the conversation about housing is how do people who want to live in Wayland get access to housing in your community? So thinking about maybe, for what is the valid public purpose in requiring local preference? And if there is one, we're not saying you should get rid of it, but we think everybody needs to think about it. So those are kind of the 5 goals and the strategies that we want to engage you in a discussion in. But I guess before we dispatch everybody to breakout rooms, if you have questions about anything I just said, I'm happy to try to answer them. So there are some questions in the chat. Tyler, Alexis, Fiona, do you want to kind of read them off? Because I can't see them where I am here.
Sure, Judy. Yeah, we got a couple.
Yeah.
So first of all, Ellen Tone asked, what does buy down refer to? I think working group member Susan Weinstein gave a pretty good answer in the chat, but I think we should answer it for everybody.
Yeah, so some communities buy a property and they basically operate it as affordable housing. They might turn it over, for example, to their housing authority. There are other housing trusts that basically step in to buy the property so that they can control who's going to get it, really to be able to put an affordability restriction on it and then resell it. So essentially buying down, the price of the house to control the resale. Another way that communities do buy down programs is to provide funding to a potential home buyer to close the gap between what the buyer can afford and what the seller reasonably expects. So there's different models for buy down, but it's just a great way for community to think about creating some affordability from the existing housing stock, focusing especially on older homes that may not be selling at $900,000 in today's market.
Great. And then another question from Karen Blumenfeld. What does local preference refer to? Talked about that.
Okay.
Here.
I didn't want to get too granular on this, but I'm happy to answer that question. So there's a provision in state regulations that allows communities to ask the Department of Housing and Community Development for permission to make some percentage of the units, the affordable units in a development, preferentially available to people who either live in the community or have some connection to the town, say they work there, or they have kids in your schools, like through the METCO program or something. So you can ask for permission. It's not automatic, but generally, if it's been an amicable process and the state is convinced that it won't hurt the marketing effort, they'll allow you to ask the developer to set aside in the marketing process a preference category for people who meet one of those sort of local connection categories. We recently did a study for the city of Newton where it was really pretty obvious that what local preference was doing was actually ending up with units and affordable units going to white households in Newton, even though the applicant pool was dwarfed by minority applicants from outside Newton. So I think it's just it's something to really think about, is how are you actually achieving diversity and equity in your town? If in fact there is this preference process that's elevating the competitiveness of local residents to have a unit, that may make people feel good and there may be a good reason to do it. So I don't want to get negative about it, but I think that you just want to ask yourself, what is the valid public purpose we're serving here? And is that valid public purpose as important or more important than the fundamental principles of equity and diversity and inclusion? It's a discussion I think every community needs to have.
Okay, great. Let's see, going through the chat here. Again, Ellen Tone asked if I think this means, are we aware of the idea of converting the town building to housing and then moving town offices to the town center? Yes, we know about that. I just want to take the opportunity to say the list of strategies Judy went over is not necessarily the entire final set of things. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if we wrote a bit about that. We do know all about that. Sarki gave me the rundown the other day. So if there's something you don't see here, there will be an opportunity in the groups to mention that, but just know this isn't, comprehensive. This is meant to be, a good solid overview of everything, but there are a few things we didn't include. So yes, is the short answer. Next up, Janet Mendler de Suarez has a few comments. She asked, what do you see as the principal barriers to affordable housing in Wayland? I will say that webinar number 1 talked a lot more about that. That's sort of in the previous section. Those materials are available on the website, and there's a whole section in the plan about barriers. So tonight we're going to try to focus on the goals and strategies, but there will be opportunities to explore barriers. And then I think your next couple of comments might be better suited to discussion in the breakout groups. You're sort of getting into the weeds of, okay, what would the steps be to enable affordable ADUs as of right? And then talking about an idea of combining conservation cluster with the promotion of affordable housing, both I think important discussions, but maybe I think the breakout groups will have opportunities to discuss in small groups some of the details and questions and concerns about these strategies. So I think you should bring those up there. Let's see. Susan replied. Again, I think a lot of these are good comments to bring it to the groups. Okay, I think those were the only questions. And we do have these comments, and we're not, ignoring them. But I think rather than questions for the group, we'll save them for the next step. So Judy, unless there's anything else you want to say, I think I'll sort of explain the next steps. Thank you so much for going through that presentation for us. That is good. So now you've heard Judy sort of describe these goals and strategies. Now we're going to break into 3 smaller groups where each of us, myself or one of my colleagues, will be sort of facilitating and taking notes. If you were at the last meeting, you'll recognize this program we use, Miro. It's just like a virtual whiteboard, essentially. And taking notes on what you say, you'll see all the goals and strategies are listed out, and you will just have the opportunity to go through them and hear your thoughts. Did you like them? Did you not like them? more details needed, and then there will be an opportunity to say, is there anything we missed? So in the interest of time, I say let's get into those groups and start these discussions. Let me just make sure the breakout groups are configured properly. I think we've had a few people come in and out. Automatically, okay. Making sure everyone is lined up. I'll move this to room 3 and we should be good to go. So I will send us to the breakout groups in a minute. And I hope we all have some great conversations. Open all rooms. So please message. Welcome back, everybody. Let's see, are the breakout groups fully closed? All right, I think everyone's here. So I want to thank all of you for showing up. I know my group had a great conversation. I'm sure all the rest of you did too. And I'm also pretty sure that you probably didn't get through everything. That is okay, because we are preparing to, this slide says, make the exact same Miro boards that your facilitators just used to take notes and put your comments up. We are planning to make that available to the public to fill in the notes on their own time. Will be the exact same thing, all the strategies listed, and you'll be able to put your comments under each one. So that will go live soon. It might take a day or two for the town to get it up on the website. We wanted to wait until after the actual session and you all had a chance to do it. The PDFs for the notes of the breakout groups, as well as this presentation, will be posted so you can see what some of the other groups talked about. And yeah, like I said, watch the town website for a link to this Miro board. If you had other comments on other strategies you didn't get to, feel free to go back in and do them. If you know people who are interested in housing issues in Wayland who couldn't come tonight, I know there were plenty of people who signed up who couldn't make it, spread that around and we'll be doing our part to get the word out. But this is sort of a new strategy we're trying, in this age of digital media. There's really no reason why you can't offer people this opportunity. So hopefully we'll get a wide range of engagement, both from you folks and from others. And yeah, we look forward to reading all of your thoughtful comments. Probably the next you'll hear from us, after this, we've received public comment now on all of the draft sections of the HPP. The next step is to put together a full draft for the working group to review, and eventually that will be made public, the whole draft, before it's officially accepted. So you will all, if you are interested, will have the chance to read the whole plan. Not exactly sure when to expect that, but early next year. I'd say, which at this point is not saying that much. The year's almost over. My email is here, Tyler at barrettplanningllc.com. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, I don't know, feel free to reach out to me. The input from the citizens of Wayland is just such a huge part of this project. It always is. You all know more about your community than we do. So it is really great when you all decide to come share that knowledge with us. And we always learn a lot. So with that, I think that's all. I hope all of you have a great night. If you want to ask me any last minute questions, you can raise your hand, put it in the chat. But otherwise, yeah, have a wonderful night. Look out for that link on the town website in the coming days.